Good to see you. So kind of still pretty much kind of an open discussion today. Somebody did suggest that I talk a little bit about this EvapoRust experiment I did. I'm not promoting or denigrating EvapoRust as a tool. I did use it the first two planes that I think I worked on, and the whole reason I decided to play around with it was that Sargent plane that I showed you guys, the Shaw's patent. When I finally got back to it, because I bought that plane almost 2 years ago. When I finally got back to working on it, I was getting ready to sharpen the iron, and I noticed that the iron was quite dark, and I thought, I wonder if it was blued, you know. And then I looked at all the other parts, and I realized, you know what, that plane went for a bath in EvapoRust. That was one of the very, very first planes I got, and I got all the rust off of it with EvapoRust. So it had the gray cast to the metal. So that, kind of, I got it all cleaned up and finished it all up, and it looks terrific. But got me wondering, the biggest thing I've always heard about the EvapoRust, and I've seen a lot of posts where somebody has something that's partially submerged and it leaves a line on there. And a lot of people have posted that, oh, that line's permanent, you'll never get it out. And just seemed kind of hard to believe. Though. Yeah, it seemed kind of hard to believe. So I thought I would do a torture test. And I took this little number 4 junker that I've got. This is one of my Japanning planes that I test Japanning on. And I thought, I'm just gonna throw this thing in EvapoRust for a long time, couple of weeks, and see what happens, And I'm gonna submerge it so that part of it's in EvapoRust and part of it isn't. We're gonna try to do the worst thing we can do to this plane and see what happens. And it was interesting what I found. I think there's some myths about what EvapoRust does, and I think there's some truth to some of the challenges that it presents. So it definitely takes rust off. There's no doubt about it. It removes rust. It doesn't dissolve cast iron. The plane was in there for a long time, and it's just as much plane is there now as when it went in. So it's not like an acid. In fact, it's pH on EvapoRust is 6.2. pH of vinegar is 2.4. pH of battery acid is about 2.3. So if you're going to use vinegar on a plane, you better keep a close eye on it. You may not have anything left. But as far as that line goes, that was the real shocking thing. So obviously it left a line, rust above the line, dark gray metal beneath the line. It does leave a gray film on the metal. It can be removed. It comes off pretty easily with a wire brush. You can probably get it off with Scotch-Brite pads or whatever. But what was really interesting was that line, and I'll show you what's so, I think, fascinating that really is something to be wary of if you're going to use EvapoRust. And I think it's a fine tool people can use. Not everybody has access to all the different tools. See if I can figure out how to do this here. Having trouble with my share. And I think if you have something that's really deeply pitted, pretty hard to physically remove the rust from deep pits, so it's an option. But there's that line. And now this has been completely cleaned off with a brass wheel, and you can still see that line. And if you catch it in the light, it's not just a line, it is a really deep groove. It is. Yeah, it's at least a 32nd of an inch deep. So.
But you just said that the EvapoRust doesn't dissolve the steel.
What's that?
You just said that the EvapoRust does not dissolve the steel.
It does not dissolve cast iron. But what was happening right here, this is the submersion line. I initially set the plane on its side so that half the sole would be exposed and half wasn't. And as soon as I went and set it on my workbench, apparently it fell over in the bucket. So it sat this way, and the top of the cheek was all that was not submerged. But what was happening is the EvapoRust, which is a water-based chelation compound, it gets drawn up on the cast iron by capillary action. It wets the surface slightly above the level of the EvapoRust, but it's water, so it evaporates right there. And every time water evaporates off of cast iron, it leaves rust behind. So then the EvapoRust capillaries back up there, and it chelates the rust off the plane, and then it gets wet again, and it evaporates, and more rust forms. And so it's just going through this rust removal cycle right there at the transition between the evaporust and the air, right at the surface. It's just perpetually rusting and removing rust and rusting and removing rust. And so the rust is really what removed the cast iron, and the evaporust removed the rust. And yeah, sure enough, I think if I'd left that in there for about a month and a half, that cheek probably would have fallen off. I'd have a top piece and a bottom piece, and I think it would have just kind of laser cut a line right through it. So certainly not getting something completely submerged in evaporust. Now that line didn't form until about day 4. And that's, if you leave a plane in evaporust for day 4, you bought the wrong tool. Really overnight is more than enough. But man, if you leave it in there for very long and it's not completely covered, you're going to hate yourself in the morning. So anyways, I don't use evaporust. I still have what I bought originally. I've used it on my table saw when I spilled something on there and didn't know it and got some rust on there. But I don't use it on hand planes. I deeply pitted ones. I haven't had one bad enough to go back and use it. But I think it can be done. I think it can be done safely. There's a lot of talk about the surface that it leaves behind. You do have kind of a dimpled surface, but I don't believe that's really the evaporust. I mean, evaporust simply doesn't dissolve cast iron. It removes rust, but the rust is always micro pitting the surface. So once you take rust off, what you have left behind is the surface that the rust gave you. So you're going to highlight it. It's going to show you every imperfection when you're done. So at any rate, that was my playing around with it. Like I said, I thought it'd be fun to leave. And I actually only left it in there for 11 days. I got bored after that. Nothing was really changing after 11 days. So, but I did get an email from somebody who forgot about a plane they'd put in evaporust. And I think it was in there for a couple of months, but it was completely submerged, and they went and got it, and no ill effects. So I'm, like I said, I'm not.
After 2 months?
Well, a couple of months. Someone left one in a couple of months, and it was, fine. But I wouldn't recommend it.
I'm wondering, because like with vinegar and anything that you're going to submerge cast iron in, it does go into the pores, right? Cast iron's porous.
Yep.
So I've got this number 605 flat side that I did a restoration on, and this part of the plane was severely pitted. So I braided it down, got most of it off, but you can see it came back out. I'm wondering if the evaporust would go down and get the underlying issue. So there's an underlying issue in this plane with that pitting portion.
That's what happens actually.
It'll definitely remove the rust. I mean, it'll go down in there and it'll get all the rust out.
Not with side effects.
It's probably a much gentler way to do it than more common phosphoric acid, which is in most of your rust removers. Most of them are phosphoric acid based, and you have to wash those, neutralize those afterwards. Otherwise, the phosphoric acid will continue to eat the steel as long as it's present, which the evaporust won't do. So it'll get it out of there, and it'll reveal the pitting. It will probably make it look worse because some of it's full of rust right now. So it's deeper than what you see. But I think the nice thing about getting the rust out of there is you can then put oil or whatever you want to use to prevent the rust from coming back, and not, end up revisiting rust on that pitted plane, again and again. So
that's what I tried to do after I'd cleaned the cheeks. I oiled the snot out of it. I mean, basically coated the surface and let it sit there for, I don't know, a couple hours before I went and wiped it off and rubbed it all over everything else. But that rust still came back. And that's because there's something down inside those pits.
Yeah. I got something to offer for that.
Yeah, Mark.
I have a little experience. I would remove rust or when you flatten the bottom of the plane, you grind it and you expose fresh metal. And there's certain spots that like you said, the rust is in the pores and you can't see it per se, or it's a little different color. It'll keep rusting at that same spot. And early on, the solution that I had was throwing it into evaporust And then of course that changes the color of the whole plane. And you have to go in and try to re-brighten the metal or whatever, because it has
Yep.
that gray brown color. But what I found was that when I take it off the sandpaper or off the honing plate, if I immediately treat it, if it's got one of those spots, if I immediately treat it with the CRC 336, and I'll take a Scotch-Brite pad and rub that area especially and give it a heavy treatment right in that spot, and then let it sit for a couple of days. And if it starts to come back, hit it with the CRC 336, the Scotch-Brite pad, and it'll eventually quit. And with each, you'll take that surface rust off that's forming with the Scotch-Brite pad, like the maroon works real well, and it eventually quits. Sometimes it takes about 3 weeks, but
Yeah.
I don't know. I found that to be a more satisfactory method than using the evaporust, which gets pretty
You
expensive.
take away less material as well
Yeah.
by doing your
I-
technique. Yeah, I did almost the same, so it's nice to hear that someone else is doing the same too.
Where do you buy the CRC?
I
You
can
can
get it from
on,
Amazon.
Yeah, you can get it from Amazon. You can get it from. They may have it at Home Depot. Yeah, that's one. There's some
Yeah.
some that are spray, some that are squeeze spray.
Yeah.
Any
But it
preference?
works. It eventually gets into those pores and somehow dampens that hot spot, and it will stop. I've done it over and over.
That really bad number 7 Fulton that I did that was so terribly pitted. There were a couple spots on there that what I did is because they were really deep. They were probably, I don't know, almost 1/8 of an inch deep, small pits. And so I put a little phosphoric acid on a Q-tip, dabbed it on there, waited about 30 seconds, washed it off, looked at it, dabbed it again. But man, really precision treatment with that. And then of course, washed it all off really well. But
one last point, like you're saying, you do need to get, if you've got those pits, Ted, that if you can see rust in there, you need to try to get that out either with a wire brush, or in my case, I can use the bead blaster. And in some cases, if you can't get it out of there, you may have to go to the evaporust, but get it out of there first and then try the CRC, and it should slow it down with a few treatments.